Hello and welcome to the latest episode of This Week in British History with me, Philippa Lacey-Brule. If you love British history, then you are definitely in the right place. These episodes go live weekly, but if you can't wait that long in between, please do come and find me on Facebook, Instagram and Pinterest. The links to all of my platforms are in the show notes. We're looking at events which happened between the 5th and the 11th of October. A few weeks ago I did a Great Fire of London special, the Great Fire of London of 1666, but that was by no means the only Great Fire that happened in England, and it wasn't the last. In 1852, the Great Fire of Newcastle and Gateshead, so we'll talk about that. Also in this week, in 1903, the Women's Social and Political Union was formed. They would be instrumental in getting the vote for women. However, there's a little twist in that, so stay tuned. And in 1982, Henry VIII's flagship, the Mary Rose, which had sank in 1545 in the Solent, was finally brought to the surface. But that is only a tiny part of her salvation story. Shortly after midnight on the 6th of October 1854, what would become to be known as the Great Fire of Newcastle and Gateshead started. By the time it was over, it would have claimed 53 lives, injured hundreds and devastated buildings and streets on both sides of the River Tyne. Gateshead and Newcastle stand on opposite sides of the River Tyne. Both had expanded rapidly during the Industrial Revolution, and as lots of places that did do the same, quite haphazardly, buildings on the river because of exports and imports, warehouses, jetties, all in a haphazard fashion had sprung up in close proximity to each other. To give you some context, Newcastle quayside at this time was the largest in the country for the processing and export of coal. The fire started in a worsted factory on the Gateshead side of the river. Worsted is a high quality woolen yarn. The factory was full of wool and oil, and, as was the norm at the time, was gaslit. Fire was a known hazard. The factory itself was stood on the site of its predecessor, which had previously burnt down. Next door to the factory was a sulphur warehouse. Now, this warehouse had been built to be fireproof, but the intense temperatures coming from the worsted factory next door actually ignited the sulphur in the warehouse just from the sheer temperature the sulphur got to its ignition point. Sulphur, when it burns a bright purple, and the sky was now lit purple. The firefighting crews who had been working on the fire at the factory now turned their attentions to the warehouse. But what happened now was that the factory roof caved in, sending burning embers flying out into the sky. Those settled and set off further fires. The spectacle of purple skies had begun to draw the crowds, and people started to gather on the river bridge to watch. Purple skies weren't going to be the only entertainment for the crowds who were gathered there that night. At 3 a.m, there was an explosion at a disused coal jetty running up to the warehouse, quickly followed by a second, and then a third so immense that it tore open the cellars of the warehouse. The force of that explosion was so huge that it sent heavy debris 3/4 of a mile away. That's 1.2 kilometres. The reverberation of the explosion was felt as far away as North Shields, which is 10 miles or 16 kilometres away. Residents there thought there had been an earthquake. Heavy debris had been thrown around 3/4 of miles away from the centre of the explosion, but light debris was making its way 6 miles away. Miners working in a colliery 11 miles away came up to the surface, concerned to the cause of the vibrations they had felt. So that just gives you an idea of the power of this explosion. The crater it left was 40 feet deep and 50 foot wide. Parts of Newcastle now were on fire too. The explosion had ripped off rooftops, and now burning debris was flying down into those buildings, setting them alight. Firefighting crews on the Gateshead side had been buried under the rubble from the explosion, and now Newcastle was on fire as well. Telegraph poles were down, telegraph wires were down, so getting a message out to get further help was impossible. As soon as the telegraph wires were repaired, a call went out for assistance to the surrounding areas. Fire engines from Shields and Sunderland were dispatched, and military detachments from Tynemouth, Sunderland and Carlisle came on the earliest trains. These combined efforts had the flames under control by the end of the day. The spectacle continued to draw in the crowds over the weekend, with an estimated 20,000 people coming by specially laid-on trains to see the devastation. The official inquiry couldn't explain the source of the initial ignition of the fire at the factory or of the subsequent explosion. On the 10th of October 1903, Emmeline Pankhurst formed the Women's Social and Political Union. It was a women-only political movement and leading militant organisation which were campaigning for the rights for women to vote, so women's suffrage. At the time that Emmeline Pankhurst set up the Women's Social and Political Union, women were seen as unequal under the law to men. And one of the key areas of this difference was that men were able to vote and women weren't. Now, it wasn't as simple as all men could vote and no women could vote. Only men of a particular social standing were actually able to vote at this time. And indeed, Emmeline Pankhurst's movement wasn't seeking the vote for all women at all. She ran the movement with her two daughters, Christabel and Sylvia was actually expelled from the movement for her insistence that they should be campaigning for the right for all women to vote of all classes. For the campaign for women's suffrage did not at this time include the working classes. The WSPU began with peaceful protests, but increasingly became known for their militant tactics of direct action and civil disobedience. They increasingly turned to actions which broke the law to raise the profile of their campaign. Many were arrested, and of those, many of them went on hunger strike and were forced to endure the horrors of force feeding. What I found really interesting about this story was the expulsion of Sylvia from the movement itself for insisting on including the working class in this movement, because I think that can sometimes be forgotten, is that what they were actually after was the vote for women who were landowners or of a particular class and above. It was not votes for all women. Now, that could have been that it was just an important step in order to get votes for all women, but I think these nuances in history are important for us to recognise. To agree with the cause doesn't necessarily mean to agree with the tactics, and many of those that were employed by the WSPU were unlawful and did put people in danger. But such was the frustration from them of how slowly the movement was gaining any kind of traction through peaceful means. Now, although we know women did end up with the vote, so eventually it did work, but even Queen Victoria was against women having the vote, by the way, if you didn't know that. But also, this was fodder for some male politicians to say, why would you give women the vote? Look how mad they are, look what lengths they will go to. They're not stable enough to be trusted with a vote. On the 11th of October 1982, the longest ever up until this point outdoor live broadcast was beaming pictures to 60 million people worldwide of the Mary Rose being raised up from the seabed of the Solent. The Mary Rose had sank on the 19th of July 1545 in the Battle of the Solent between the English and the French. The French had amassed off the Isle of Wight, and the Mary Rose, flagship of Henry VIII, went into battle. She turned too quickly, and although the ideas about why she sank are varied, water got into her open gun ports, and took the ship down very, very quickly. Of 500 men aboard, only 35 survived. The screams of those men could be heard by Henry VIII, who was stationed at Southsea Castle watching the battle. Now, it was a human tragedy, nearly 500 lives lost, but also it was an expensive tragedy. Ships were expensive, but so was the cannon and the ordnance, the weaponry on board. Estimated to be, in today's money, worth around £2 million, that which went down with the Mary Rose in 1545. And so orders were given immediately to try and retrieve her from the seabed. Shipwrecks were not unusual, and there were in fact specialist salvage teams. In the case of the Mary Rose, one of these specialist salvage teams was employed almost immediately. 31 Venetian divers, supported by 60 English sailors on the surface, were to try and raise the Mary Rose whole from the seabed. The way they were going to do this was to run 2 cables underneath the ship. Those cables were attached to other ships, which would sail apart from each other, and raise the Mary Rose up to a point in the sea where she could be pumped out and floated again on the surface. At least that was the theory. It didn't work, and the operation itself ended up damaging the foremast and probably the mainmast of the Mary Rose, making future attempts to raise her from the bed even more difficult. Now, the ship might not be able to have been raised, but leaving the ordnance or that weaponry on board was not an option, and so another team of salvage operators was employed. This team specialised more in the diving down to wrecks to recover objects. A man called Peter Paolo Corsi from Italy was employed, and he brought with him his small specialist team. He had a team of 8, 3 of which we know the names of: Jacques Francis, John Eco and George Black. Now, we know more about Jacques Francis because he was called upon to give testimony in a court case a few years later about Corsi, his boss, who had been accused of theft. We know that Jacques Francis was of African origin because when he gave his testimony at the court case of Corsi, he said that he had been born in an island off the west coast of Africa. Now, these islands were notorious for shipwrecks, and it was the perfect training ground for a salvage diver. There's 2 other things that we can glean from Francis's appearance at court. 1, that his testimony was admissible in a court of law, and 2, that he was employed. He was paid for his work. So how do we have African divers working on English shipwrecks in Tudor times? Well, the English didn't swim, let alone dive in freezing cold waters, massive depths as well. But the English didn't swim. It wasn't a skill that was taught, and especially in sailors, it was seen as bad luck. I suppose 1, because you're kind of tempting fate that your ship will sink, but 2, other ships weren't in the habit of coming back for people off wrecks, so it was thought to be better that you just drowned quickly. Now, despite Corsi, Francis and the rest of the team's efforts, much of the Mary Rose's ordnance was left on the bed of the Solent, and slowly over the centuries mud would bury most of her. That wasn't buried was washed away. A 19th century effort to raise her again ran out of money, but interest in her never waned. And a group of amateur divers, also made up of historians and archaeologists, formed the Mary Rose 1967 committee. At this point, this committee was self-funding and reliant on donations. And so began the very long process to where we are today, where you can go and see the Mary Rose dried out and preserved with many of her artefacts on display at the Mary Rose Museum at Portsmouth Historic Dockyard. They started the committee in 1967, self-funding, reliant on donations, and in 1978 they made the decision that yes, they were going to try and raise her. And so a charity was formed. This charitable trust was needed to raise the enormous amounts of money that were going to be needed to not only bring the Mary Rose up from the seabed, but take on the task of preserving her and displaying her after that. The president of the charity was His Royal Highness Prince Charles, the Prince of Wales, who had actually dived down on the site in 1975, so he had quite a personal link with this cause. It wasn't just a matter of raising the ship herself. There was all the artefacts still there, which ranged from a robust cannon down to a delicate wicker basket. 19,000 artefacts were retrieved with her. Between 1979 and 1982, 500 divers made around 27,000 dives to not only to retrieve artefacts, but to carefully record where they found everything. Not only did they recover objects, but also the skeletons of some of the sailors who had been on board on that fateful day in July 1545, and even that of a dog. At 9:03 in the morning on the 11th of October 1982, the Mary Rose saw daylight again for the first time since 1545. Many boats had gathered to watch this and set off their claxtons. There was a gun salute from Southsea Castle. It was a tremendous moment. And 60 million people watched this moment as she came out of the sea again. But this was just the beginning of her preservation. She was taken slowly to Portsmouth into dry dock number 3, where now there's a museum built around her, but the very long, painstaking process of preserving timbers which had been under the sea for hundreds of years had to begin. If you've been to see the Mary Rose before 2016, you'll remember there were lots of drying tubes up and down her length. Now they have all gone. She is preserved and stable finally, but it just goes to show that's what a long process this was going to be. She was raised in 1982, and in 2016 the drying tubes were finally removed so that you can see an uninterrupted view of her now. If you'd like to take a virtual tour of the Mary Rose with me, I've put a link to the video that I've done, which you can do. I've also done a roving reporter report for the Tudor Society about the Mary Rose from the Mary Rose Museum and also from Southsea Castle, which you can look at if you're a member of the Tudor Society, and I will put a link below so that you can join. There's a 14-day free trial, so you can go in and have a look around. If you're a Tudor fan, then I'd highly recommend it. I think you will love it. Thank you so much for joining me this week for This Week in British History. If you've enjoyed it, please do give it a thumbs up, drop a comment below, subscribe to the channel and share it with fellow history lovers to help spread the word. Until next week, take care, have fun. I'll see you next time.